Welcome to Great Books, Big Ideas. I'm Jim. If you're new to the channel, I hope you like the video and become a subscriber. For this episode, we continue our series about the Great Conversation by Robert Maynard Hutchins, the first volume in the Great Books of the Western World set. We're up to Chapter 5, Experimental Science. And in it, we find Hutchins defending the idea that there are other methods for discerning the truth of things beyond the scientific method. Let's survey some ideas from this interesting chapter. We think that experimental science is something new within, let's say, the last 200-300 years. Actually, it's not. What is new is the, quote, faith in the experiment as an exclusive method. Hutchins objects to those who would put science on a pedestal and privilege it over other methods. These people presume that unless statements are verifiable, they are merely conjectural or meaningless or unanswerable. All that matters is what you can measure, count, and confirm as facts. But when you think about this, isn't it the case that the scientific method's answers are always provisional? That's how science works. It's never more than probable. Maybe leaving aside fields like mathematics and logic, where you can get a lot of certainty. Certitude is hard to come by in science. Science is always revising itself. But what has science to do with big ideas? Questions like, does God exist? Is the soul immortal? Science has nothing to say. It cannot confirm nor deny. Such questions are relegated to the backwater neighborhoods of faith and superstition. And what about political questions like, is democracy the best form of government? Do we need world government in order to secure a global peace? Again, experimental science cannot test these questions, at least not yet. You hopefully see the problem Hutchins is trying to expose here. The ideas of thinkers who preceded the modern era of experimental science, they are seen as irrelevant, aside from a little historical value, perhaps, while thinkers who postdate the scientific revolution are the only ones worth listening to, and they have an outsized significance. This view is actually heralded by an Enlightenment thinker who appears in the Great Books of the Western World set, David Hume. Here's a quote. When we run over libraries persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning facts and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. The other side of this argument would hold that the real sophistry and illusion is contained in the positivism of the scientific thinkers instead. Positivism confines itself to sensory data and excludes a priori or metaphysical speculations. It stems from the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who lived from 1798 to 1857. Hutchins thinks that both sides of this argument are engaging in dogmatic thinking. Let's talk a little more about the scientific method. If by scientific method we mean thinking that is honest, careful, precise, and discriminating, well, it's hard to oppose any of that. Call us all scientists then. But this is a rather broad definition of scientific method, maybe not very useful. If it means restricting our attention to facts, Then you could say the same of ancient thinkers like Aristotle or the medieval theologians. They too tested their statements against sensory experience, to some degree at least. Well, nobody here is denying the indispensability of facts. Facts are necessary. But, Hutchins asks, are they sufficient? And he thinks not. The scientific method is, or should be, much more than the aimless accumulation of data, as he calls it. Now, one virtue of the great conversation, as enclosed in these books that Hutchins is introducing, one virtue of that is how it contains many approaches to seeking the truth, including the experimental method. Whether the experimental method is the only legitimate method is a judgment you will have to make after reading the great books. But to bypass such consideration by not reading the great books is to beg the question. One reaches a conclusion that has already been assumed. For example, science is good and valid. Everything else is bad and useless. Now, certain fields of scientific inquiry lend themselves more reliably to experimental methods. Think of the distinction here between the hard and soft sciences. Fields like physics and chemistry, they benefit the most from experimental methods. But what about social sciences? They have an enormously difficult time applying experimental methods. And Hutchins quotes a social science professor, Robert Redfield, on this point. Robert Redfield has suggested that his colleagues consider their relation to the humanities as well as to the natural sciences. Quote, the imitation of the physical and biological sciences, he says, has proceeded to a point where the fullest development of social science is hampered. Identification with the natural sciences shelters the social scientist from a stimulation from philosophy and the arts and literature which social science needs. The stimulation which the social scientists can gain from the humanities can come from the arts and literature themselves and through an understanding of some of the problems which interest philosophers and the more imaginative students of the creative productions of mankind. For Redfield, humanity is the common subject matter of both the traditional humanities and social sciences, and they use different methods accordingly. We have so much to learn from works of art, insights you can't gain from other methods. Is it wise to abandon the wisdom found in history, philosophy, and the arts? Hutchins thinks it is unwise. What do you think? Experimental science has not made the great conversation irrelevant, he says. It has a seat at the table. It's an important one, but it's not the only one, not the only voice in the room. It shouldn't be the only voice in the room. And yes, science has yielded great knowledge of the natural world that has rescued us from a lot of ignorance, but it also has limits, and it can be misused. And we need these other methods of inquiry to determine where the boundaries and limits of science are, and to provide clues to solutions to problems that science cannot solve. Do you agree with Hutchins? I tend to agree with him, but I feel like many out there are so swept up in the throes of unquestioning faith in science and data that they don't see the benefit of philosophy and history and literature and the arts. Have we gone too far in trusting science? Can we recognize when and where science is being abused and misused? Can we distinguish between sound scientific method and junk science? We need to step outside the experimental method and recognize its limitations and where it should best be applied to solving problems. Anyway, that's what's on Hutchins' mind in this chapter. This brings us halfway through the Great Conversation essay. In his next chapter, he will discuss the idea of whether a liberal education can really be attained by everybody. He's touched on this before, but now he's going to dive deeper into that topic. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back on the channel soon. Take care.